Okay, welcome to the Scotonomics Festival of Economics, the Leith iteration. So, hello everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Karen Van Sweden and I'm an Aberdeen City Councillor and I'm also co-host of Scotonomics. So, over to you, William.
Hello, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Brett Christophers.
I've got the rest of the introduction. So, few people know more about the UK economy really than Professor Brett Christophers. So we are delighted that Professor Christophers is here to open our 2025 Festival of Economics.
Right, so we're going to turn to the UK, and I'm going to consider a couple of points in your book, The New Enclosure, which I think is the oldest one in that little
of
stack.
Those four, yeah.
Yep. So let's start with land. Can you first explain what the enclosure was? And then can you explain the new enclosure? Some of you may know the kind of importance of the enclosure, but I thought just a brief summary. But why is it so important, the enclosure, in terms of historical economics? And then what happened, kind of post Thatcherism, I think is round about the period you're talking about.
So the original enclosure movement was, in a sense, the sort of the precondition for the emergence of industrial capitalism in Britain, including very much in Scotland. So the Highland clearances would be, I guess, subsumed under that heading of enclosure by many historians, although is absolutely analysed separately. So enclosure was basically where, again, to radically simplify a very complex historical story, was that historically land was typically held in common, which had nothing to do with ownership, but it was rights to access and use land. And so the enclosure movement was where land to which the general population had common rights of access and use.
And that was for subsistence, wasn't it?
For subsistence, where those rights were essentially stripped from them. And so therefore, large sections of the population, in order to continue to subsist, eventually had to sell their labour power to an emergent class of capitalists in order to survive, basically, because the rights to those lands were changed and enclosed. Those rights were enclosed through the enclosure movement. And so Marx referred to that as the primitive accumulation, the basis upon which all subsequent capitalist accumulation was based, because it was only because of the enclosure movement that you had a huge class of wage labourers that emerged and had to sell their labour power to an emergent class of capitalists. And as I say, in Scotland, the enclosure movement was essentially the Highland clearances. Now, that was a closure in the UK. In the British case, occurred over the course of centuries, not decades, but was concentrated in the latter part of the 18th century, very early part of the 19th century, and continued through until the mid 19th century. And so it was all about land and changing rights to use and access to land. Now, what that book refers to as the new enclosure is not enclosure per se in the same historical sense, but what happened, particularly after Thatcher came to power, it began a little bit before then, but it really accelerated from the beginning of the 1980s, was that a very significant amount of land across Britain that was public land, so owned by the public sector in one shape or form, either central government or, in particularly in England and Wales, local government. A huge amount of land that was owned by the public sector was privatised, beginning in the early 1980s, and this process is still going on today. And I'm happy to talk about kind of the scale of that phenomenon, but So when we talk about privatisation in the British case, we typically talk about things like, water, electricity, gas, ports, all the rest of it. One thing we often don't talk about is land. And the point of the book is to say that actually, in terms of kind of monetary value, far and away the biggest historical privatisation in the British case is land. An enormous amount of land that was owned by the public sector has been privatised and was sold off often on the cheap to property developers, other property companies, financial institutions, other types of landlords. And so the book is basically trying to expose that phenomenon, because it's a phenomenon that hadn't previously been given much attention.
And the scale of that sale of public land?
So at the end of the 1970s, it's hard to put exact figures on it, but at the end of the 1970s, the state, in one shape or another, the public sector owned about 20% of all the land in Britain. And then when that book came out in 2018, and the best estimates I could do then were that half that land had been privatised by 2018. So the public sector ownership of land across Britain had gone from 20% of British land to 10% of British land over that period. Today it will be even lower than that. Now, the point about being a geographer is all of that has been very geographically. It hasn't been, the extent of public land ownership and the subsequent extent of privatisation of that land have not been geographically even across the country. So in Scotland, for example, that process has been much less marked than in England, in Wales, but partly because the public sector didn't own as much land in Scotland as it did in England and Wales. There's been less to privatise in that sense. So it's been very much concentrated in England and Wales, and it's been and again, it's varied across the public sector. So it's the local government land estate has been particularly severely denuded, partly under pressure under the Thatcher government, which essentially forced councils to sell their land.
Okay, and why should we worry about that? Why is land so important?
Well, I think two very basic reasons for that. One is that land is very valuable, and it's only become more valuable in terms of the price of that land in recent decades. So in a way, the terrible irony of it is that precisely during the period over which that public land has been privatised, often very, very cheaply, is precisely the period when that land has become incredibly valuable. And so essentially we've been selling off the family silver, so to speak, very, very cheaply. And so, in a sense, the public wealth, the common wealth, has been denuded of a huge amount of value from the pub that we essentially own collectively through the government, indirectly if not directly. So there's the pure value side of it, and then the other thing is, of course, that land is essential to essentially all types of human activity, whether it's commercial activities, whether it's recreational activities, whether it's political activities, public protest. And when you change the land, the ownership of land, you change the conditions under which all of us can access and use that land. And again, that's why I use the term enclosure, because essentially what we've seen is this new enclosure where through privatisation, the scope for the public at large to use land has been increasingly constrained by virtue of the fact that it's gone from public to private ownership. Now, that's not to say that the public sector is always a perfectly kind of open custodian of land. That's not necessarily the case. But in general, historically, it's been a more open custodian of land than the private sector is.
So I think when we're looking at certainly the use of land for food, and we're also going to touch on the use of land for kind of other ecological services. The principle is that if you own something, you can pretty much do with it what you want. That's the kind of capitalist mainstream framing, isn't it? If you own land, you can do what you want with it. So if we're selling a lot of it and it's going to people who are private, they are able to do with it what they want. And I've got a quote, because you mentioned Adam Smith here. And he said in The Wealth of Nations, there still remain in both parts of the United Kingdom some great estates which have continued without interruption in the hands of the same families since the times of feudal anarchy. Compare the present condition of these estates with the possessions of the small proprietors in their neighbourhood, and you will require no other argument to convince you how unfavourable such extensive property is to improvement. You know, and I think when we're looking at kind of the ecological challenges, we need to start viewing land very differently. So, you know, I know that was still, it was only what, seven years ago when you wrote that, but have your views on land changed, especially when you've been going into, you know, asset management and areas like that, and with the climate crisis and
no, I wouldn't say they've changed, but what I would say is that you can't understand the energy transition, and in particular the different types of economic activities and institutions that fossil fuels on the one hand and renewables on the other are, without understanding land, not least because renewables are a much more land intensive activity than fossil fuels are. Fossil fuels are typically subterranean, they're buried, and renewables are a surface phenomenon, and if it's not out of the sea, then they occupy a lot of land, and so land costs play an incredibly important role in understanding how renewables to get developed, where they get developed, under what economic conditions. So no, I don't think my views have changed on it, but it's that, you know, trying to look at questions of the energy transition and particularly renewables. Those questions around land ownership kind of resurfaced in doing that work.
You mentioned Scotland and the land ownership. Just quickly, is there anything specific in terms of land ownership that you would like to highlight in Scotland before we move on?
Well, Scotland is famous, and I'm sure most people in the room already know this, but it's, you know, famously concentrated land ownership. I mean, I know I think you've got Andy Whiteman coming tomorrow night, right? And he's written a great book on this. The Poor Had No Lawyers, is that the title of the book? But he and others have been very kind of persistent in highlighting, you know, the massive concentration of land ownership, where, you know, a handful of families, precisely like that quote, where, you know, going back in history, own an incredible proportion of the land in Scotland. And I think the other thing that's interesting about, I'd say two other things are interesting about Scotland. A is the massive inequality of land ownership in Scotland, the fact that it's concentrated in very few hands. I think B is the real kind of obscurity of it, and the lack of information about it. So the proportion of land where we actually know who owns the land is much lower in Scotland than in England and Wales because of historic registration problems. A lot of it is owned offshore through shell companies and so on. So there's a real transparency issue in Scotland. And I think the other thing is, you know, in a way, paradoxically, I think that more has been happening in a progressive direction where land ownership is concerned in Scotland over the last 2 decades than is true in England and Wales, in terms of, you know, community land ownership, growth in community land ownership. But I think partly that's simply because it couldn't have got any worse in Scotland. It's like if you're going from an incredibly low base, you can exactly. And so, you know, it's like, is the glass half empty or is it half full? I mean, it has been more progressive, but it's because it could only go in that direction in a sense. But I do, you know, there is a land commission in Scotland, whereas, you know, there isn't one in England, and that in itself is positive. And so I think that, you know, and you know, there's a community right of first refusal when land comes available for purchase, which again is not true in England and Wales. So I think that there have been more positive steps occurring, but the reality is that land ownership remains incredibly concentrated. And I think the climate, you know, again, perversely in a way, the climate problem has in a sense been reconcentrating land ownership because there are all sorts of incentives and subsidies available for very wealthy people to buy land in Scotland and reforest it and so on, and make a lot of money out of doing that.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount of that going on. We're going to
Yeah.
talk about that a bit more detail when we're in Dundee tomorrow with Andy Whiteman. So let's go back to the UK's business model. And from the book, again, it said since the 1990s, most of the increases in wealth have come from land and building appreciation in the UK.
Absolutely.
So not a little bit. But you're saying, Kev, the basic business model for the UK is appreciation of land and buildings, and I think the land was like 60% of it in itself.
Yeah.
So our kind of wealth is being appreciated, not purely, but significantly from prices going up.
Absolutely.
Instead of innovation. And,
absolutely. That's true. It's an asset price bubble, essentially, is what it is. Yeah.
So how does this fit into the idea of an innovative or a creative economy and a model?
I mean, it doesn't fit. I mean, it doesn't fit at all. But I just saw some data last week actually that the most common type of company now in England and Wales, I don't know about Scotland, is buy-to-let landlords is now the most common type of company in England. If you look at data from the Office for National Statistics about which sector of the economy has contributed most to the UK's growth in GDP over the last 2 decades, it's private landlordism, and so that's in a sense that's the business model of the UK is renting.
Yeah, and Scotland's obviously a part of that. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if that is any different, but I would imagine it'd be pretty similar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, any questions or thoughts from you? Yes, Andrew.
Just on the issue of afforestation and tree planting, you need to be a wee bit careful and look at the actual data and not the headlines in the newspapers. The recommendation of the Committee on Climate Change of 30,000 hectares, 30,000 hectares of woodland creation every year. Across the UK, we aren't even doing half of that, we're nowhere near that. And the forestry budget last year was cut by 40%. And the area of broadleaf woodland has gone up a bit, but we're still only at 18% compared to like 40% across the rest of Europe.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And a lot of interest, there's a lot of focus on commercial forestry, but if you actually look at the statistics on commercial forestry, it's only gone up by 0.7% in area in the last 25 years, in net area.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of noise and a lot
It's a fairly high level though, isn't it, in Scotland in terms of commercial forestry, if you compare it to, let's say, community-owned forestry, for example.
Yeah, and a lot of absolutely. There needs to be a lot more local authority, as you're saying, that issue around local authority ownership of land, that's the bit that's missing in Scotland in particular.
Certainly compared to England and Wales.
But there's a lot of noise and a lot of the big obvious bad examples around Brewdog and Aberdeen and others.
Yeah.
But if we're going to decarbonise our society, we need a lot more timber.
For sure.
More fibre.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of some of the headlines in the newspapers aren't hugely helpful and aren't actually focused on the fact of what's going on at a national level.
Thank you. Andrew helped me write my dissertation on new woodland creation, so thanks for reminding me of that in terms of the figures.
And most is still owned by the Forestry Commission, right?
It's owned by the Scottish Ministers on behalf of the Scottish people.
Yeah.
And a lot of community ownership for good reasons is actually land that was Forestry Commission land, Scottish FLS land, that has then gone into community ownership.
Yeah.
And what community ownership hasn't really done is shifted land from big private landowners into...
Can I just take advantage of this and ask you a question about land reform? So what's your thoughts on land reform? Have we gone too far, not far enough? Are we concentrating on the wrong things?
Not far enough. But it's the models of governance, I think. And I think that's the issues with a lot of community land ownership is how do you do governance? And I think I'd love to see local authorities and council own a lot more land. You've got Pentlands here. I think what Leith should be doing is afforesting woodland creation in the Pentlands to reduce flooding and that. How do we make those connections a lot better, and how do we do that? For me, those are some of the outcomes of land reform. Is we could get much better connections between communities and the land that surrounds them, and it's rural, it's urban as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, we've got a couple of questions there. I'll ask the gentleman first, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's just on the man's point there. It's also a political agenda as well, isn't it? I mean, we should probably stop subsidising hill farmers and rewild their land instead of keep paying people to work on rather uneconomic farming activities and use this kind of misty-eyed idea we have about farming and things. So it's not only there's a political agenda that just supports things that are rather counterintuitive.
Yeah. We both say it depends, doesn't it? Yeah. As an institutional economist and a human geographer, I think these points, and there's a lot of this. You're probably right, but we really need to look into detail about what that actually would mean. And it's the same with the dropping of the reforestation budget as well. What impact will that have? Who is getting that money anyway? These are things I think are really important to spend the time and look into it in detail. Do you want to answer that point?
Well, no, it was a comment more than a question. I agree. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And the lady next to you?
My question was going back to the point about the UK business model being so much based on the appreciation of land value, which is a big concern for me because it seems to be self-perpetuating. Our pensions are based on the expectation that the land value is going to keep going up and up. The government has kept feeding that bubble, making the problem worse and worse. How does it work in other countries? How do they fund pensions, for example? Because I think that's the main problem. Why as a country we're so reliant on it?
Well, I think that I think that other countries are, to one degree or another, also bound up in the same problem. I think the UK it's worse here. I think there are all sorts of other countries where you have something quite similar going on. I mean, a lot of that land. I think the thing to remember is a lot of that land value is residential land value. It's tied up. It's specifically housing wealth much more than anything. It's residential land value that has appreciated most by far. There's some great statistics that suggest that if you go back to around the 1930s or so, that the on average the proportion of the value of when you're buying a home the land was like 2 or 3%. And today it's something like on average 70%. So the housing market is basically a land market now to significant, and that's true in most other countries as well. But I think it's particularly true in the UK. I guess that's partly because of the geographical scope of the UK. The density of the but even in places like Australia, their economies are fundamentally driven by land markets as well.
I think
land and housing markets.
When we had Steve Keane here last year, he said, it's something that every new administration kind of has on their desk as the problems, and then they just very quickly push it off because it's the bravest government who starts saying to people who are older, who vote, your house is worth too much, we need to do something about it.
Yeah, no politician's going to go there.
And that's the fundamental problem, isn't it? It's so clear that there's issues around intergenerational equality around housing wealth, but who tackles that?
Yeah, nobody's going to tackle it. Yeah. Partly because if you look at, again, this is getting off topic a little bit, but if you look at the proportion of homeowners versus renters that vote in elections, it's almost double the proportion of homeowners versus. So no politician is going to alienate the homeowning population.
Yes, gentleman here.
So I think it's quite safe to blame everything on Mrs. Thatcher and a certain Nigel Lawson who deregulated the city, started tearing up all the social contracts which had been established in the post-war. Can you sort of posit where we might be now if the Big Bang in the city hadn't happened? Because you started your introduction by saying that Britain is the most privatised, but many other countries have slavishly followed because they wanted to attract the capital which would flow into a deregulated system. So that's one question. Can you do a think piece about how it would be? But also, and then
Another book
is
for
there
you,
any
Brett.
country that you're aware of where they haven't taken the Kool-Aid of privatisation and selling those family silver and so on, which we could look to as an example of how to try and recover?
Great, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, ironically, one place where that has actually done much less in terms of privatisation is actually the US. Strangely enough, you know, there is still much more public sector ownership, particularly federal ownership of public utilities, public assets, water, for example, transportation assets, than there is in the UK. Strangely enough, I mean that's something we don't hear about very often, which I think has been a good thing for the US actually. So I think there are definitely many countries that have gone much less far down there. Most continental European countries have gone less far in that direction than the UK. In fact, nowhere's really gone as far as the UK in privatising everything that can be privatised. In terms of what the UK would look like, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I think the thing about the Big Bang, which was essentially which is kind of the colloquial term used to refer, as you said, to the deregulation of the city, was that in a sense that was, at least my understanding was that was in significant part about trying to arrest the decline in the role internationally of the City of London. So Britain in general, but London obviously in particular, had historically been dominant in international finance for a long time. It was losing that dominance rapidly, specifically to the US in the 1960s and 1970s, and it was kind of a defensive measure to at least try to at least stem that decline by basically turning London into an offshore financial centre. Essentially, is what happened. And obviously one of the long-term consequences of that has been to change the fabric of London, where London became essentially a home for quasi-corrupt international kleptocracy. Yeah, absolutely. So it's massively changed the fabric of the nation and of London in particular, socially and physically as well as economically. It's hard to say what would have been different. I mean, I guess some people would say, well, it stemmed the decline, what was already the economic decline of the nation. The counterpoint with that would be to say, well, you know, if it would be to say, well, investment would have gone into other parts of the economy, which would have been more productive for the economies. But it's obviously, you know, counterfactually is always a bit hard to theorise. But that's what it was all about, was just trying to arrest the long-term decline, which it did to a certain extent, although Wall Street obviously became dominant anyway. But the UK has retained a role in the international financial system that it wouldn't have done were it not for the deregulation that occurred.